Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. English is the language of protesting across the world. Today, let's learn the vocabulary and techniques that you need to protest in English and understand why people take to the streets. You can find the full transcript of today's episode over on the Thinking in English blog. Head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more content, and leave a like, review, or rating wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's episode. Earlier this week, I released an episode on protests in Iran. Thousands of Iranians have taken to the street, unleashing their anger over the murder of a young woman by the country's morality police, as well as decades of severe government policies. As I was writing that episode, major protests and demonstrations also erupted in Russia. After losing ground to Ukrainian forces over the past few months, President Putin has decided to call Russia's reserve forces. Hundreds of Russians have been arrested for protesting against that move, and videos show men from regions like Dagestan being forced onto buses as Russia aims to recruit up to 1 million new soldiers. Protests are everywhere and happen all the time. They are an essential part of democracy, and they allow people to communicate their anger, displeasure, opinions, and ideas to the country's leaders. I put the word protest into the Google News tab today. As well as results concerning Iran and Russia, I found Al Jazeera articles on Tunisian protests over inflation, and a France 24 article on protests in Colombia against new tax reforms. And all of that was on the first page. I've recorded, on Thinking in English, episodes on protests in Myanmar and Belarus, and on environmental protests in the UK. Protests are an essential part of democracy. Every day, in every country, protests occur for different reasons. Demonstrations against human rights violations and authoritarian governments. Protests over the environment, tax increases, or police brutality. Protests can occur for social, political, economic, and cultural reasons. As previously mentioned, I have written about a lot of protests around the world, and I have read even more. And one thing that has always stood out to me is the use of the English language. English is everywhere in demonstrations and marches. The slogans, the signs, the statements released often use English. Images from the 2021 demonstrations in Myanmar showed demonstrators carrying signs that said, "We want democracy and your help can support our Myanmar citizens." Only 5% of people in Myanmar can speak English, and the country is regularly ranked as one of the lowest English language ability places in the world. But despite this, the protesters used English to make their signs. And this is because English is the international language. It is the language used when you want to spread your message to the international community. If you want people or governments around the world to hear your words and understand your message, you need to use English. I read a really interesting opinion article from the South China Morning Post a few years ago. It was a letter from a Hong Kong citizen suggesting that Hong Kongers need to be more confident in using English to explain their thoughts and opinions on the pro-democracy protests that were happening at the time. The writer argued that it is so important for local people to be the voice of their own issues, and that they need to use English to be as effective as possible. Considering how important English is to protesters, I decided to talk to you all about protest English. After introducing some of the key vocabulary around protests, which will also help you understand English language news reports, I'll talk a little about persuasive writing and speaking, an essential skill for any demonstrator. So, let's start at the beginning with vocabulary. A protest is a statement or action expressing disapproval of or objection to something. Protests can take many forms, from peaceful letter writing to marches and rallies to violent riots and looting. Alternatively, the noun demonstration can also be used as a synonym for protest. When I was a student, I often attended demonstrations over university price increases and human rights issues. Demonstration can, and often is, shortened to demo. A march is a form of public protest or demonstration, where people walk together to highlight their cause. You can go on a march, as in, I'm going on an environmental march this weekend. March is also a verb. We often use the phrase march on when a march is deliberately walking towards somewhere. For example, we marched on the Parliament to demand the President's resignation. A person who attended a protest or demonstration can be described as a protester or demonstrator. Right now, there are millions of protesters and demonstrators around the world trying to express and explain their opinions. Both protest and demonstration have verb forms as well. Iranians are currently protesting over the death of a young woman, and thousands of Russians have been arrested for demonstrating against the policy of conscription. For those of you who love English grammar, in US English, the verb protest is often used transitively, as in, he protested the decision, or they protested the new law. And you might also hear the phrase, take to the streets. This is often used in media and news reports, as in, people took to the streets in response to the war. If you are organising a protest or demonstration, you might also want to know the verbs to do this. You can hold or stage a protest and hold or stage a demonstration. For example, we are holding a demonstration this Friday, or they staged a protest against the government cuts. If an event causes a protest, we can use the verbs spark and trigger. Police brutality triggered large protests across the country. Or the new law sparked demonstrations. Most protests are peaceful or non-violent. This means they cause no damage to people or property. If the opposite happens, it is usually described as violent or angry. Last year, angry protests erupted across the USA in response to police brutality. If a protest starts to become violent or uncontrollable, it may develop into a riot. A riot is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd. You can also use riot as a verb. Football fans rioted after their team lost. How about the vocabulary for different tactics used by protesters? Well, you will often see people carrying placards and banners. A placard is a sign for public display, which is often large and handwritten and carried during a protest. Banners are similar but much longer pieces of material. but both placards and banners are used to display messages or your demands. If you ever see a protest march, you will probably hear them chanting. Chant can be used as both a noun and a verb, and refers to a phrase that is repeatedly shouted. Protesters in London chanted "Boris Johnson out" in front of his house. And to make their voices louder and easier to hear, demonstrators may use a megaphone. In London a few years ago, the Extinction Rebellion protesters blocked roads and train lines to demonstrate their beliefs. This is a common tactic. Blocking a road causes disturbances by stopping people's access. I attended a quite radical university for my master's degree. If you're interested, SOAS, University of London. One of the favourite tactics used by university students, not me, but by other students, was occupying a space. If you occupy a building, it means you move in and take control of it. I remember students occupying the university library to protest a reduction in the number of librarians. Other tactics include sit-ins, where you sit somewhere and refuse to leave. Boycotts, where you refuse to be associated with something, buy a product or use a service. Candlelight vigils, where you remember or commemorate a tragedy at night. Egging, where you throw eggs at a person. Hunger strikes, when a person refuses to eat. And picketing, where you stand outside a workplace as a protest and part of a strike. Now you know the English vocabulary to describe and talk about protesting. I think it would be good to briefly introduce a few tactics to help you use English to demonstrate or protest. Many of you will take to the streets at some point in your life, and most of you will protest something in private or on social media. And if you want your message to be heard by as many people as possible, you need to use English. Persuasive English. When protesting against something, you should use persuasive language. Either you want to persuade the government to change their minds, a company to be more responsible, or the international community to support your cause. I've received lots of messages on Instagram from Iranian people and Russian people asking me to make episodes on the situations in their countries. And they do so by persuading me. It's kind of a form of protest against. They are protesting against their government by asking me to make an episode on their situations. So how can you use persuasive English? Well, if you're delivering a speech in English, use short words and short sentences. You want to sound natural and confident. So using simple language can make it much easier for you to read and for the audience to understand. Tell a story. Whether you are sending messages to people online, writing letters, giving speeches, or something else, try to tell a story. A good story can be a lot more powerful than just facts and statistics. And use examples that will highlight the issue. For example, rather than giving a fact about climate change, use a story about the destruction caused by climate change. Be concise. When speaking, writing, messaging people, don't take a long time to explain your issue. You can be persuasive in only a few sentences, and it's less to read. Give your own personal opinion. You can say something like, "in my view," or "from my perspective." hyperbole, or exaggeration. So obviously you shouldn't lie, but you can exaggerate your language to make your message more powerful. Try to use these exaggerated or powerful adjectives or verbs to describe your situation and why you want change. Personal pronouns, so using I, you, and we, can help you connect to your audience. This is something that I do in my podcast. I talk about myself, and I talk to you, the listeners. The rule of 3. In English, it is common to use 3 points to make an argument, 3 adjectives to describe a situation, and 3 examples to convince an audience. And I just used the rule of 3 right then. I use it all the time. You'll notice it all the time when I'm speaking, when I'm writing this, because the rule of 3 is so powerful. Emotive language. This is used to make the listener, reader, and audience feel a particular emotion. If talking about the environment, you might want people to be scared about the future of climate change. When protesting the government, you probably want people to be angry. When protesting maybe over animal rights, or you want people to become vegetarian or vegan, you might want people to feel disgusted. And you can do this by choosing certain words and describing things in a certain way to make them feel that emotion. So decide what emotion you want people to feel, and then use language that's going to help you achieve this. And rhetorical questions. These are questions that you ask, but don't need to be answered, because the answer is obvious. For example, who doesn't want freedom? This kind of question, everyone wants freedom, so you don't need to answer it. Banners and signs. So now I've talked about persuasive language, I want to end on a little advice for writing a sign, placard, or banner in English. Look at any protest around the world. You will see signs written in English. So how can you write an excellent message? Well, the first thing is to decide what you want to say. You have to be specific. There may be hundreds of different things you want to say about the issue, but you need to just choose one important message per sign. Don't try to cram every idea into one sign. Once you have your message, you need to decide what to write. And the key here is brevity or shortness. When writing a protest sign in English, make it short and clear. A statement of less than 7 words is usually the most effective. This may seem too short, but it is the most powerful way. You can also try to omit or avoid using things like the or a or an. Take those away. Just make your message as powerful and as clear as possible. For example, if you are attending a women's rights protest for pay equality, you could write equal pay for equal work. If you are attending an environmental protest, something like climate justice now is a powerful slogan. You can also make this message personal. Relate it to your identity, experience, or own opinions. You could take a famous saying or slogan that already exists and parody it. Donald Trump's poster from his election campaign was his face with the word hope written underneath. If you attend an anti-Trump protest now, you'll probably see a similar sign with the word grope instead of hope, referring to Trump's many legal problems in the past. You could make your sign rhyme or use a pun. Use the words and vocabulary used by your enemy against them. The people you're protesting against, use their slogans if they're a company, or use their words against them. And you can swear, you can curse, you can use bad language. It doesn't make you seem stupid, it makes your language more powerful in English. Basically, do whatever you can to make people read your sign, understand it, and remember it. And for this reason, a short, catchy, rhyming, sometimes funny sign can be the most powerful. So here is today's final thought. English is the language of protest all around the world. To spread your message and opinions, using English is the most effective tool to communicate with different people. And with major protests in Iran and Russia this week, as well as demonstrations happening in every city almost every day, it's always useful to practice and understand protest English. So today I tried to introduce some of the most important vocabulary about protests and then gave you a few tips on how to use English to communicate your messages. This is by far not an exhaustive list of vocabulary or a complete guide on how to use English as a protester. If you have any tips or advice for other people listening, maybe people in Iran, people in Russia who are currently protesting against their governments, or maybe if you're an Italian person who wants to protest your new government, or a Brazilian in the lead up to your election in the next few days and weeks, maybe you want to think about protesting. So, what do you think? Have you ever attended a protest? What was the last major protest in your country? And do you have any tips or advice for other people who are planning to protest and how they can use English to help them? Let us know in the comments on the blog, the comments on Spotify, or send me a message on Instagram if you want to stay anonymous, and I'll share it out with everyone else. If you love listening to Thinking in English, please leave me a rating, a review, wherever you are listening right now. We're getting closer and closer to 3,000 ratings on Spotify. That is awesome. I can't believe that. In Instagram, we just hit 8,000 followers, which is also awesome, also amazing. And I'm planning on uploading more content there. I've got a few ideas of things I want to make. And if you really love listening, please subscribe to my Patreon account. We do conversation clubs, which are really great. The conversation clubs are awesome. There's usually 6 to 10 people joining. We split into different groups. We choose a discussion topic every week, and we make questions to help guide the conversation. But really, it's an amazing opportunity for you guys to speak in English. And for just $5 a month, so it's like $1.25 a session if you join every week. If there's 5 sessions in a month, then it's $1 a session. So it's probably the cheapest opportunity you're going to get to have a structured conversation with an English teacher, or me, I guess I'm an English teacher, an English teacher present. Join the conversation club. And also you'll be supporting me, and you can have one-on-one classes with me if you join the higher tier, and you can also get extra bonus episodes. And I'm about to be unemployed. Well, technically I am. From October 10th, I am unemployed. So I have no money. So please sign up to the Patreon and help me turn Thinking in English into a business. Well, thank you for listening, and I will see you all next time.